Superannuation or CPF? Which one is better when it comes to planning for your retirement in Australia? Hi there, Jared Brown here, Australian expat financial planner here in Singapore. Welcome to my video today where we are exploring which is going to be better, superannuation or CPF, when it comes to planning for your retirement down under. Let's dive in and have a look at some of the key attributes and key variables between these two structures. Now, the first aspect to look at is tax. Of course, a bit of a national pastime in Australia is to minimise the tax payable as much as possible. Now, when it comes to tax between CPF and superannuation, superannuation is often going to be the most tax efficient vehicle that we have. When you retire in Australia and you reach that condition of release, your superannuation up to the transfer balance cap, which is currently $1.9 million, can grow tax-free, can receive dividends tax-free, and can pay you a regular income that is also tax-free. In the event that you're retired in Australia and you still have a CPF account, that foreign income is going to be taxed in Australia, and you will need to pay tax to the ATO based on that foreign income, in addition to any currency gains between the Singapore dollar and the Australian dollar. So bear that in mind when it comes to planning for your retirement, particularly if you're nearing sort of 50, 55 in Singapore and you do have a CPF account, because it'll be getting close to time to make some decisions around retirement annuities and what you would like to do with your CPF account going forward. So that's item number one, is the tax difference between the two. Now, aspect number two is the actual investment returns. So we put this money into CPF or superannuation. What do we actually do with it once it's inside? And this is where the return differences become quite important. Now, in Singapore, the majority of people simply leave their CPF in the ordinary special accounts and don't do anything else with it. They don't invest it, they just receive the guaranteed rates of return. Now, in the special account, on the first, usually $40,000, you receive a bonus amount of interest, assuming you're under the age of 55, and the return you're generating there is 5.01%. On your ordinary account, the OA, the guaranteed rate of return is 2.5% or 3.5% on the first $20,000. So on the first 60, we're getting a reasonable rate of return of about 4.5% as an average annual return. That obviously drops as the balance grows and you go into those lower guaranteed rates of return. Now, if we compare that to superannuation in Australia, and if we just look at a balanced index option inside super in Australia, that has delivered an 8.12% annualized return over the last 20 years. So about a 4% difference between CPF, assuming you don't invest that money, and superannuation in Australia. Now, 4% may not sound like a lot until you actually compound that over time. And if we look at, let's say, for example, $100,000 invested over 20 years, and that generates a 4% annual return, being the difference between superannuation and CPF. That grows to about $220,000. So what is the message there? Well, it's not really that CPF is bad and superannuation is good. It's that you need to be, or at least should be, considering doing something with your CPF money and not simply leaving it to receive the measly guaranteed rates of return that you are. So certainly review that as an option. That is aspect number two, investment returns. Now, number three is contributions. Now, if you are a permanent resident or a Singapore citizen, obviously you can contribute to CPF in Singapore. You do need to consider whether it is right for you to become PR if you're not already. Obviously, if you are, you don't really have a choice. Your choice is only on the employee contributions to consider whether you should max those out or not. So, of course, do your homework with that one. If you are living and working in Australia, naturally your employer would be contributing to your superannuation fund. So usually there is an option or an eligibility to contribute to both. If you're in Singapore on an employment pass, dependent pass, you're not a permanent resident in Singapore, then maybe superannuation is better, or maybe you consider something outside of super and CPF altogether that would be contributed to your super when you actually return to Australia. But don't simply assume that because you're out of Australia you can't contribute to super, or that you shouldn't. Run your numbers, consider which one is right for you, and maybe it's a combination of both. So that's a bit on the contributions, not a huge amount of difference between the two, but just consider what makes the most sense. The final aspect when it comes to comparing CPF and superannuation are the investment options within. Now, superannuation is a lot more diverse in terms of what we can invest in when we compare it to CPF. The CPF investments are quite restrictive, particularly the special or retirement account. The investment options are very average. They are really designed to be quite conservative up to a balanced risk profile, whereas superannuation can go into direct shares, into property, into gold, hedge funds. Essentially, the options are relatively limitless on a global level. It doesn't mean to say that superannuation is better or worse. It just means to say that our investment choice is certainly a lot wider and a lot more diversified than CPF is. So based on all of this, as an Australian expat living and working in Singapore, what should I actually be doing? Now, there are 5 key things that you should be doing when it comes to your retirement planning, whether that be superannuation and/or CPF. Number 1 is to review your CPF and make sure it's invested in line with your risk profile. Number 2 is to plan ahead and consider the tax implications. Number 3 is make sure that whether it's in superannuation or in CPF, you don't simply have cash sitting idly. Make sure it's invested in line with your risk profile. Number 4 is to make sure that you have beneficiary nominations in place, particularly with your superannuation. It's not automatically an estate asset, meaning that you need to have or should have a separate nomination of beneficiary in place when it comes to your superannuation fund. You may also want to consider how your CPF ties in to your overall estate plan as well. And the final tip for you, that is tip number 5, is to not ignore your repatriation plans. When it comes to returning to Australia, if you're going to retire in Australia or retire between Australia and somewhere else, consider how these things will be taxed and consider the return you'll be able to generate. Thank you very much for tuning in. It's a bit of a summation on superannuation versus CPF. Consider which one is right for you and plan your retirement accordingly. Thank you for tuning in. Drop me a note with any questions. I look forward to seeing you in the next video.